Hello, my dear students. Welcome to Teacher at Home. Today, class, we are going to learn the seventh chapter Women, Caste, and Reform. Have you ever thought of how children lived about 200 years ago? Nowadays, most girls from middle class families go to school and often study with boys. On growing up, many of them go to colleges and universities and take up jobs after that. They have to be adults before they are legally married. And according to law, they can marry anyone they like from any caste or community, and widows can remarry too. All women, like all men, can vote and stand for elections. Of course, these rights are not actually enjoyed by all. Poor people have little or no access to education, and in many families, women cannot choose their husbands. 200 years ago, things were very different. Most children were married off at an early age. Both Hindu and Muslim men could marry more than one wife. In some part of the country, widows were praised if they choose death by burning themselves on the funeral pyre of their husbands. Women who died in this manner, whether willingly or otherwise, were called sati, meaning virtuous women. Women's right to property were also restricted. Besides, most women had virtually no access to education. In many parts of the country, people believed that if a woman was educated, she would become a widow. Differences between men and women were not the only ones in society. In most regions, people were divided along lines in a caste. Brahmins and Kshatriyas considered themselves as upper caste. Others, such as traders and moneylenders, often referred to as Vaishyas, were placed after them. They came peasants and artisans, such as weavers and potters. At the lowest rung were those who labored to keep cities and villages clean or worked at jobs that upper caste considered polluting. That is, it could lead to the loss of caste status. Upper caste also treated many of this group at the bottom as untouchable. They were not allowed to enter temples, draw water from the wells used by the upper caste, or bath in ponds where upper caste bathed. They were seen as inferior human beings. Over the 19th and 20th century, many of these norms and perceptions slowly changed. Let us see how this happened. Working towards change. From the early 19th century, we find debates and discussions about social customs and practices take, taking on a new character. One important reason for this was the development of new forms of communication. For the first time, books, newspaper, magazine, leaflets, and pamphlets were printed. These were far cheaper and far more accessible than the manuscript that you have read about in class 7. Therefore, ordinary people could read these and make of them. Many of them could also write and express their ideas in their own languages. All kinds of issues, social, political, economic, and religious, could now be debated and discussed by men in the new cities. The discussions could reach out to a wider public and could become linked to movements for social change. These debates were often initiated by Indian reformers and reform groups. One such reformer was Raja Ram Mohan Roy. He founded a reform association known as the Brahma Sabha, later known as the Brahmo Samaj in Calcutta. People such as Ram Mohan Roy are described as reformers because they felt that changes were necessary in society and unjust practices needed to be done away with them. They thought that the best way to ensure such changes was by persuading people to give up old practices and adopt a new way of life. Ram Mohan Roy was keen to spread the knowledge of Western education in the country and bring about greater freedom and equality for women. He wrote about the way women were forced to bear the burden of domestic work, confined to the home and the kitchen, and not allowed to move out and become educated, changing the life of widows. Ramohan Roy was particularly moved by the problems widows face in their lives. He began a campaign against the practice of sati. Ramohan Roy was well versed in Sanskrit, Persian, and several other Indian and European languages. He tried to show through his writings that the practice of widow burning had no sanction in ancient texts. By the early 19th century, as you have read in chapter 6, many British officials had also begun to criticize Indian traditions and customs. They were therefore more than willing to listen to Ramohan, who was reputed to be a learned man. 1829, Sadi was banned. The strategy adopted by Ramohan was used by later reformers as well. Whenever they wished to challenge a practice that seemed harmful, they tried to find a verse or sentence in the ancient sacred text that supported their point of view. Then they suggested that the practice as it existed at present was against early tradition. In this popular festival, devotees under a peculiar form of suffering as part of ritual worship, with hooks pierced through their skin, they swung themselves up on a wheel. In the early 19th century, when European officials began criticizing Indian customs and rituals as barbaric, there was one of the rituals that came under attack. We first tied them down to the pile. Ramohan Roy published many pamphlets to spread his idea. Some of these were written as a dialogue between the advocate and critic of traditional practice. Here is one such dialogue on Sati. Advocate of Sati. Women are by nature of inferior understanding, without resolution, unworthy of trust. Many of them, on the death of their husbands, become desirous of accompanying them, but to remove every chance of their trying to escape from the blazing fire in burning them, we first tie them down to the pile. Opponent of Sadi. When did you ever afford them a fair opportunity of exhibiting their natural capacity? How they can you accuse them of want of understanding? If after instruction, knowledge, and wisdom, a person cannot comprehend or retain what has been taught him, he may consider him as deficient. But if you do not educate women, how can you see them as inferior? For instance, one of the most famous reformers, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, used ancient texts to suggest that widows could remarry. His suggestions was adopted by British officials and a law was passed in 1856 permitting widow remarriage. Those who were against the remarriage of widows opposed Vidyasagar and even boycotted them. By the second half of the 19th century, the movement in favor of widow remarriage spread to other parts of the country. In the Telugu speaking areas of the Madras Presidency, Veerashalingam Pandulu formed an association for widow remarriage. Around the same time, young individuals, intellectuals, and reformers in Bombay pledged themselves to working for the same cause. In the north, Swami Dayananda Saraswati, who founded the reform association called Arya Samaj, also supported widow remarriage. Yet the number of widows who actually remarried remained low. Those who married were not easily accepted in the society, and conservative groups continued to oppose the new law. Girls begin going to school. Many of the reformers felt that education for girls was necessary in order to improve the condition of women. Vidyasagar in Calcutta and many other reformers in Bombay set up schools for girls. When the first schools were opened in the mid 19th century, many people were afraid of them. They feared that schools would take girls away from home, prevent them from doing their domestic duties. Moreover, girls had to travel through public places in order to reach school. Many people felt that this would have the corrupting influence on them. They felt that girls should stay away from the public spaces. Therefore, throughout the 19th century, most educated women were taught at home by liberal fathers or husbands. Sometimes women taught themselves. Do you remember what you read about the Rash Sundari Devi in your Social and Political Life last year? She was one of those who secretly learned to read and write in the flickering light of candles at night. In the later part of the century, schools for girls were established in the Arya Samaj in Punjab and Jyotirao Phule in Maharashtra. In the aristocratic Muslim households in North India, women learned to read the Quran in Arabic. They were taught to by women who came home to teach. Some reformers, such as Mumtaz Ali, reinterpreted verses from the Quran to argue for women's education. The first Urdu novel began to be written from the late 19th century. Amongst other things, they were meant to encourage women to read about religion and domestic management in a language they could understand. Women write about women. From the early 20th century, Muslim women like the Begums of Bhopal played a notable role in promoting education among women. They founded a primary school for girls at Aligarh, and the remarkable women Begum Rokeya Sagawat Hossain started schools for Muslim girls in Patna and Calcutta. She was a fearless critic of conservative ideas, arguing the religious leaders of every faith accorded an inferior place to women. By the 1880s, Indian women began to enter universities. Some of them trained to be doctors, some became teachers, some women began to write and publish their critical views on the place of women in society. Tarabai Shinde, a woman educated at home at Pune, published a book, Sri Puristulna, Comparison Between Women and Men, criticizing the social differences between men and women. Pandit Ramabai, a great scholar of Sanskrit, felt that Hinduism was oppressive towards women and wrote a book about the miserable lives of upper caste Hindu women. She founded a widows' home at Pune to provide shelter to widows who had been treated badly by their husbands' relatives. Here, women were trained so that they could support themselves economically. Needless to say, all this more than alarmed the Orthodox. For instance, Hindu women were adopting Western ways and that this would corrupt Hindu culture and erode family values. Orthodox Muslims were also worried about the impact of the changes. As you see, by the end of the 19th century, women themselves were actively working for reform. They wrote books, edited magazines, and founded schools and training centers and set up women's associations from the early 19th century. They formed political pressure groups to push their laws for females' suffrage and better health care and education for women. Some of them joined various kinds of nationalist and socialist movements from the 1920s. In the 20th century, leaders such as Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhash Chandra Bose lent their support to demand for greater equality and freedom for women. Nationalist leaders promised that there would be full suffrage for all men and women after independence. However, till then they asked women to concentrate on the anti-British struggles. Once a woman's husband has died, in her book, Tarabai Shinde wrote, "Isn't a woman's life as dear to her as yours is to you?" It's as if women are meant to be made of something different from men altogether, made from dust, from earth or rock or rusted iron, whereas you and your lives are made from the purest gold. You are asking me what I mean. I mean, once a woman's husband has died, what's in store for her? The barber comes to shave all the curls and hair of her head just to cool your eyes. She is shut out from going to weddings, receptions, and other auspicious occasions that married women go to. And why all these restrictions? Because her husband has died. She is unlucky. Her ill fate is written on her forehead. Her face is not to be seen. It is a bad omen. Law against child marriage. With the growth of women's organizations and writings on these issues, the momentum for reform gained strength. People challenged another established custom, that of child marriage. There were a number of Indian legislators in the Central Legislative Assembly who vowed to make a law preventing child remarriage. In 1929, the Child Marriage Restraint Act was passed without the kind of bitter debates and struggles that earlier laws had seen. According to the Act, no man below the age of 18 and women below the age of 16 could marry. Subsequently, these limits were raised to 21 for men and 18 for women. It's a picture for a child bride at the beginning of the 20th century. Do you know that even today over 20% of girls in India are married below the age of 18? Caste and social reformer. Some of the social reformers we have been discussing also criticized caste inequalities. Ramahan Roy translated an old Buddhist text that was critical to caste. The Prarthana Samaj adhered to the tradition of Bhakti that believed in spiritual equality of all castes. In Bombay, Paramans Mandali was founded in 1840 to work for the abolition of caste. Many of these reformers and members of reform associations were people of upper caste. Often, in secret meetings, the reformers would violate caste taboos, food and touch, in an effort to get rid of the hold of caste prejudice in their lives. There were also others who questioned the injustice of the caste social order. During the course of the 19th century, Christian missionaries began setting up schools for the tribal groups and lower caste children. The children were thus equipped with some resources to make their way into the changing world. At the same time, poor began leaving their villages to look for jobs that were opening up in the cities. There was work in the factories that were coming up and jobs in municipalities. Thinking of the new demands of labor, this created drains had to be dug, roads laid, buildings constructed, and cities cleaned. This required coolies, diggers, carriers, bricklayers, sewage cleaners, sweepers, palanquin bearers, rickshaw pullers. Where did this labor come from? The poor from the villages and small towns, many of them from low caste, began moving to the cities where there was a new demand for labor. Some also went to work in plantations in Assam, Mauritius, Trinidad, and Indonesia. Work in the new locations were often very hard. But the poor, the people from low caste, saw this as an opportunity to get away from the oppressive hold that upper caste landowners exercised over their lives and the daily humiliation they suffered. The coolie ship named John Allen carried many Indian laborers to Mauritius, where they had a variety of forms of hard labor. Most of these laborers were from low caste, who could produce shoes. Leather workers have been traditionally held in contempt since they work with dead animals, which are seen as dirty and polluting. During the First World War, however, there was a huge demand for shoes for the armies. Caste prejudice against leather work meant that only the traditional leather workers and shoemakers were ready to supply army shoes. So they could ask for high prices and gave impressive profit. There were other jobs too. The army, for instance, offered opportunities. A number of Mahar people was regarded as the untouchable. Fund jobs in the Mahar regiment. The father of B.R. Ambedkar, the leader of the Dalit movement, was taught in an army school. No place inside the classroom. In the Bombay Presidency, as late as 1829, untouchables were not allowed into even government schools when some of them pressed hard for that right. They were allowed to sit on the veranda outside the classroom and listening to the lessons without polluting the room where upper caste boys were taught. Labor for upper caste landowners cultivating their fields and working a variety of good jobs for the landlord's house. Demands for equality and justice. Gradually, by the second half of the 19th century, people from within the non Brahmin caste began organizing movements against caste discrimination and demanded social justice and equality. The Satnami movement in central India was founded by Khasidas who worked among the leather workers and organized a movement to improve their social status. In eastern Bengal, Haridas Thakur's Matwas seat worked among Chandala cultivators. Haridas questioned Brahminical texts that supported the caste system. In what is present-day Kerala, a guru from Irava caste, Sri Narayana Guru, proclaimed the ideas of unity for his people. He argued against treating people unequally on the basis of caste difference. Unequally on the caste difference. According to him, all humankind belong to the same caste. On his famous statement was ഒരു ജാതി ഒരു മതം ഒരു ദൈവം മനുഷ്യന് one caste, one religion, and one God for man. All these sects were founded by leaders who came from non-Brahmin caste and also worked among them. They tried to change those habits and practices which provoke the contempt of dominant caste. They tried to create a sense of self-esteem among the subordinate caste. Gulamgiri. One of the most vocal amongst the low caste leaders was Jyotirao Phule. Born in 1827, he studied in schools set up by the Christian missionaries. On growing up, he developed his own ideas about the injustice of caste society. He set out to attack the Brahmins, claimed that they were superior to others since they were Aryans. Phule argued that the Aryans were foreigners who came from outside the subcontinent and defeated and subjugated the true children of the country, those who had lived here from before the coming of the Aryans. As Aryans established their dominance, they began looking at the defeated population as inferior as low caste people. According to Phule, the upper castes have no right to the land and power. In reality, the land belonged to indigenous people, the so called low caste. Phule claimed that before Aryan rule, there existed the golden age when warrior peasants tilled the land and ruled the Maratha countryside in just and fair ways. Proposed the Sudras and Adisudras should unite to challenge caste discrimination. The Satyashoji Samaj, an association Phule founded and propagated caste equality. Me here and you over there. Phule was also critical and the anti-colonial nationalism that was preached by upper caste leaders. He wrote, Brahmins have hidden away the sword of their religion, which has cut the throat of people's prosperity, and now go about posing as great patriots of their country. They give this advice to our Sudra, Muslim, and Parsi youth that unless we put away all quarreling amongst ourselves about the divisions between high and low in our country, come together, our country will never make any progress. It will be unity to serve the purpose, and there will be here and you will be there. Jyotirao Phule, the cultivar's whipcoat. 1873, Phule wrote a book named Gulamgiri, meaning slavery. Some 10 years before this, the American Civil War had been fought, leading to the end of slavery in America. Phule dedicated his book to all those Americans who had fought to free slaves, thus establishing a link between the conditions of the lower caste in India and the black slaves in America. We are all human beings. 18, in 1927, Ambedkar said, we now want to go to the tank only to prove that, like others, we are also human beings. Hindu society should be reorganized on the two main principles equality and absence of casteism. As example shows, full extended criticism on the upper caste to argue against all forms of inequality. He was concerned about the plight of upper caste women, the miseries of the laborer, and the humiliation of the lower caste. This movement for caste reform was continued in the 20th century by the great Dalit leaders Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in the western India and E.V. Ramaswamy Naikar in the south who could enter temples. Ambedkar was born in a Maha family. As a child, he experienced that caste prejudice meant in everyday life. In school, he was forced to sit outside the classroom on the ground and was not allowed to drink water from taps that upper caste people used. After finishing school, he got a fellowship to go to the US for higher studies. On his return to India in 1919, he wrote extensively about upper caste power in contemporary society. In 1927, Ambedkar started a temple entry movement in which his Mahakas followers participated. Brahmin priests were outraged when the Dalits used water from the temple tank. Ambedkar led three such movements for temple entry between 1927 and 1935. His aim was to make everyone see the power of caste prejudice within society. The non-Brahmin movement. In the early 20th century, the non-Brahmin movement started. The initiative came from those non-Brahmin castes that had acquired access to education, wealth, and influence. They argued that Brahmins were heirs of Aryan invaders from the north who had conquered southern lands from the original inhabitants of the region, the indigenous Dravidian races. They also challenged Brahminical claims to power. E.V. Ramaswamy Naikar of Periyar, as he was called, came from the middle class family. Interestingly, he had been ascetic in his early life and has studied Sanskrit scriptures carefully. Later, he became a member of the Congress only to leave in disgust when he found that at the least at a feast organized by nationalist seating arrangements followed caste distinctions, that is, the upper caste were made to sit at a distance from the upper caste, convinced that untouchables had to fight for their dignity. Periyar founded the self respect movement. He argued that untouchables were the true upholders of the original Tamil and Dravidian culture, which had been subjugated by Brahmins. He felt that all religious authorities, so social divisions and inequality as God given untouchables, had to free themselves, therefore, from all religions in order to achieve social equality. Vaidya was an outspoken critic of Hindu scriptures, especially the codes of Manu, the ancient lawmaker, and the Bhagavad Gita, the Ramayana. He said that this text had been used to establish the authority of Brahmins over lower caste and the domination of men over women. These assertions did not go unchallenged. The forceful speeches, writings, and movements of lower caste leaders did lead to rethinking and some self criticism among upper caste nationalist leaders, but Orthodox Hindu society also reacted by founding Satyanand Dharma Sabhas and the Bharat Dharma Mahamandal in the north, associations like the Brahmin Sabha in Bengal. Object of this association was to uphold caste distinctions as the cornerstone of Hinduism and show how this was sanctified by scriptures. Debates and struggles over caste continued beyond the colonial period and are still going in our own times. Periyar on women. Periyar on. Only with the arrival of words such as Tara Mugurdam, our women had become puppets in the hands of their husbands. We ended up with such fathers who advised their daughters that they had been gifted away to their husbands and they belonged to their husband's place. This is the result of our association with Sanskrit. Organizing for reform, the Brahma Samaj. Brahma Samaj, formed in 1830, prohibited all forms of idolatry and sacrifice, believed in the Upanishads, and forbade its members from criticizing other religious practices. It critically drew upon the ideals of religions, especially of Hinduism and Christianity, looking up at the negative and positive dimensions. Derosio and the Young Bengal. Henry Louis Vivien Derosio, a teacher at Hindu College, Calcutta, in the 1820s, promoted radical ideas and encouraged his people to question all authority, referred to as the Young Bengal movement, and his students attacked tradition and custom, demanded education for women, and campaigned for the freedom of thought and expression. Ramakrishna Mission and Swami Vivekananda, named after Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. Swami Vivekananda's Guru, the Ramakrishna Mission, stressed idea of salvation through social service and selfless victim. Swami Vivekananda, whose original name was Narendranath Datta, combined with the simple teaching of Sri Ramakrishna with his well-founded moderate outlook and spread them all over the world. After hearing him in the World Parliament of Religions at Chicago in 1893, the New York Herald reported, "We feel how foolish it is to send missionaries to this learned nation." Indeed, Swami Vivekananda was the first Indian in modern times who re-established the spiritual preeminence of the Vedanta philosophy of the social scale, global scale. But his mission was not to simply to talk the religion. He was extremely pained at the poverty and misery of this countryman. He firmly believed that any reform could become successful only by uplifting the condition of the masses. Therefore, his clarion call to the people of India was to rise above the narrow confines to the religion of the kitchen and come together in the service of the nation. By sending out his call, he made a signal contribution to the nascent nationalization of India. Senses of nationalism were, however, not narrow in his conception. It was confirmed that many of the problems facing the mankind could only be overcome if the nations of the world come together at an equal footing. Therefore, his exhortation to the youth was to unite on the basis of the common spiritual heritage. In the exhortation, he became truly the symbol of new spirit and source of strength for the future. Prarthana Samaj. Established 1867 at Bombay, the Prarthana Samaj sought to remove caste restrictions, abolish child marriage, encourage the education for women, and the ban on widow remarriage. Its religious meetings drew up Hindu, Buddhist, and Christian texts. The Veda Samaj, established in Madras in 1864, Veda Samaj was inspired by the Brahma Samaj. It worked to abolish caste distinctions, promote widow remarriage and women's education. Its members believed in one God. They condemned the superstitions and rituals of Orthodox and Hinduism. Aligarh movement. The Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, founded by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan in 1875 at Aligarh, later became the Aligarh Muslim University. Institution offered moderate education including Western science to Muslim. Aligarh movement, as it is known, had enormous impact in the area of the educational reform. The Singh Sabha movement. Reorganization. Reform organizations of the first six Sabhas were formed at Amritsar in 1873 and at Lahore in 1879. Sabhas sought to rid Sikhism of superstition, caste distinctions, and practices seen by them as non-Sikh. They promote education among the Sikhs, often combining modern instructions with the Sikh teachings. So that's all about this chapter. If you are interested, please do like, share, and subscribe my channel. Okay, thank you.